ARTmakers was made possible by the San Luis Obispo County Office of Education, Studios on the Park in Paso Robles, and the Arts Collaborative.
Welcome, ARTmakers. I'm Jessamine Pattison, and we are at Studios on the Park in Paso Robles. Today we are going to learn about one of my favorite artists, Beatrix Potter. You've probably read her book about Peter Rabbit. Beatrix Potter not only wrote her books, she drew the illustrations as well. We are going to learn about Beatrix Potter and her illustrations of nature. We're also going to make our own illustrations here at ARTmakers. Beatrix Potter is best known for her beautifully illustrated books with characters based on animals such as Peter Rabbit, Tom Kitten, and Jemima Puddle Duck. She wrote 24 children's books beginning with The Tale of Peter Rabbit. It has been translated into 36 languages, and children all over the world have read about that naughty rabbit. It is one of the best-selling books of all time. What many people do not know about Beatrix Potter is that she was a notable woman of science, as well as an artist and an author. Born in 1866, Beatrix lived with her parents and her younger brother, Bertram, in a grand house in London, England. However, she really did not like the noise and traffic found in the city. She loved the long holidays her family enjoyed in the countryside. She and her brother would spend many hours exploring the forests and surrounding meadows, sketching wildlife. She found herself studying in great detail the plants and animals found in the wilderness and around the barn. She would draw ducks, chickens, mice, wild foxes, and rabbits. In today's world, it's very easy to capture images with our cell phones and take pictures, but back when Beatrix Potter was a little girl, they didn't have portable cameras, so she had to bring her sketchbook around with her to draw nature and animals. With a lot of practice, she grew very good at what she did. As was common at that time, women like Beatrix were privately educated by a governess and rarely went to university. Yet, she loved to learn about the natural world. She was interested in botany, which is the study of plants. She collected fossils and read many books on entomology, the study of insects. As a teenager, Beatrix Potter became more serious about honing her skills as an illustrator and watercolor artist. She spent many hours visiting London's art galleries. She also studied writing, and she enjoyed penning letters to children of her friends. Beatrix would invent adventures featuring her favorite pets. In several letters, she wrote an illustrated story about 4 little rabbits. One of the bunnies, Peter, gets into a lot of mischief in a neighbor's garden. In 1902, these letters became the inspiration for The Tale of Peter Rabbit.
Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree.
Beatrix stood her rabbits on 2 legs. They had clothes, handkerchiefs, teapots, baskets, and umbrellas. Beatrix was taught how to paint in oil, but watercolor became her favorite. Over time, she mastered the style of pen and ink with color washes. To create an illustration, Beatrix would sketch with a pencil and then apply thin layers of watercolor to the foreground and background. After the watercolor paint dried, she would add outlines and details using pen and ink. Beatrix Potter's childhood love of small animals paved the way for her to become an author of children's books. Her keen observation skills and thorough knowledge of plant and animal anatomy meant that she could draw convincing, lifelike animals. Her skills in drawing using naturalism did not come at the expense of imagination. For Beatrix, the countryside was also magical, and she would later show in her art realism and fantasy could happily coexist. In Dinner in Mouseland, a realistically sketched mouse joins his family for dinner wearing top hat and tails. Her imagination gave her characters creative personalities and playfulness. Here's an excerpt from The Tale of Tom Kitten.
Once upon a time there were 3 little kittens, and their names were Mittens, Tom Kitten, and Moppet. They had dear little fur coats of their own, and they tumbled about the doorstep and played in the dust. But one day their mother, Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, expected friends to tea, so she fetched the kittens indoors to wash and dress them before the fine company arrived. First she scrubbed their faces. This one is Moppet. Then she brushed their fur. This one is Mittens. Then she combed their tails and whiskers. This is Tom Kitten. Tom was very naughty, and he scratched.
Her first book, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, was rejected by many. When she finally found a publisher, the book was an immediate and enormous success. In the following years, Beatrix wrote and illustrated 23 books, including The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin and The Tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher. Her successful career enabled Beatrix to move out of the city and into her beloved countryside. Now she could easily study mushrooms and lichen found in the forest. Beatrix became a widely respected expert in the field of mycology, which is the study of fungi. Beatrix Potter's books continue to be sold around the world, and today we are going to make an art piece based on one of her illustrations. Hello and welcome to ARTmakers. I am Jessamine Pattison, and today we are going to be making a watercolor painting based on an illustration by Beatrix Potter. Peter the Rabbit is my favorite character, and I hope you will grow to love him also in the same way that I do. So I'm just going to go over the materials. You will need a pencil, and I have actually a fun pen and ink pen just to be more Beatrix Potter-esque, but you can also just use a regular pen. Watercolor paper is very important for this. It can be student grade. It doesn't matter if this is a nice big block. Watercolor paper makes a big difference because it will absorb the watercolor instead of buckling. And then we're going to do a little warm-up in a sketchbook. So any kind of paper is fine for that, but if you want to start keeping your art in one place, a sketchbook is really fun, like Beatrix Potter did. And we have watercolors, water, paintbrushes. You only really need maybe a big and a small paintbrush, paper towel or towel, tape if you want to tape your watercolor paper down, which I did right here. So first, let's get out our paper or our sketchbook just to do a nice warm-up. It's called a pure or a blind contour drawing. So what that means is we are going to look at the object that we're drawing rather than the paper, and that helps us get more into our art side of our brain, so we're doing very careful looking. So I'm going to just go ahead and draw my hand. And just go around the outline of my fingers, and it's not going to look very accurate, you'll find. Kind of ends up looking pretty funny. The trick is to not lift your pencil or your pen. And it's important to not talk because the art side of your brain is the part that doesn't use words, it just uses images. I'm going to show you just a few of the watercolor techniques that we might be using in this lovely Beatrix Potter watercolor painting. So wet on wet here is just that. You would paint wet paint with your water and either a color or even just with water by itself. Dry brush is that also, just using less water on your brush and painting dry paint onto a dry paper. So don't have any water on it before you do. It might be for like adding details or grass. Blotting is where you would put your watercolor paint down, and then take your paper towel or towel and blot it, kind of like you do when you're using a napkin to get any excess paint on. It might be something you would use in a sky for clouds. Salt is really really fun with water. You put the water down, and while it's wet, you can sprinkle some salt on there, and you wait for it to dry, and you'll find that the salt sucks up the watercolor paint. And then once it's dry, you brush off the salt, and you have this interesting texture here that you can't get just with a paintbrush. There's also a similar effect using rubbing alcohol, where you spray in a little spray bottle. This is water, but I have one with rubbing alcohol also. You spray it like that, or you can use a Q-tip and apply it, and it kind of acts like bleach, so it will make whatever color you're using a lighter color. This is a resist technique, and you could use crayons or oil pastels for an even more colorful resist. And that means like oil and vinegar, how they don't mix. Basically, when you put oil pastel or a wax crayon down, then you put the water on top. Whatever you've put the wax on, it will not take the water because the pore of the paper is full. So it's like, no more water, no more color. The last one that Beatrix Potter was very partial to is pen and ink. So there's different ways. She used pen and ink where she would draw with pencil first, then she would apply thin glazes or layers of the watercolor paint. After it dries, which is very important because otherwise the ink will bleed like the wet on wet, she would go around her details, like here on Peter Rabbit, and add the whiskers or the little details of his fur. I have gone ahead and taped my paper down just in case it buckles. We are going to start with our pencil, and I'm going to take my Peter Rabbit over here so I can look at it. So I'm going to make sure that my rabbit takes up the whole paperwork. I'd like to put a wash down behind Peter Rabbit so we can let it dry while we do our drawing. So all that really means is we take a little bit of water and we're going to mix it with some of our paint. I have a couple palettes here. I have pre-made watercolors here, and then I use my palette over here. And it's okay to like leave it and let it get messy because you can use the colors later. And then I have other little tubes of watercolor paint that I can use to mix with my primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. So I'm going to just do a flat wash, which means it's the same all around. And we're going to learn a little bit about foreground, middle ground, and background also. So this is my foreground in the front. The foreground comes before. That's how I remember it. The middle ground is in the middle, and the background's in the back. Leave some space for Peter. Do a little blue wash in the back. We could even try a little bit of our blotting. I don't want to use a ton of blue because I don't want to take away from his blue coat. Well, see, here's my wet on wet, how it goes, how it bleeds like that. That's, I think, the most fun and most challenging or frustrating part of watercolor because you don't know exactly what it's going to do. Okay, so while we're waiting for those to dry, I also leave my paintbrushes either in a cup like this or resting on my paper towel because you don't want to leave it resting in your cup because it might give it a bad hair day, you know. They like to rest with their tips up. All right, so now we're going to focus on some of the shapes that you can find in Peter Rabbit's face and body. I found a circle here and two other circles here. Or you could just make a circle and then kind of shave off the sides. So I kind of marked where his body goes, so that helps me. I'm like, okay, his feet are gonna go down here. This body's gonna go here. His head is about this big. Just a little sketch, so I'm using pretty light lines. And I need to have an eraser. This is a kneaded eraser. It's kind of cool. You can knead it like dough to make it clean again. So that's also, you can use a very fine tip if you need to get in and take out some details. So Peter Rabbit has some chubby cheeks here. So I also found a triangle up here. I made some triangles, some upside down triangles when I was drawing this. And then I went in and drew the ears around, pull it in on the sides, leave room for the whiskers. All right, we are continuing to sketch in the shapes of Peter Rabbit. I'm drawing in the nose, and I'm going to make sure that I notice where the eyes line up with the nose or how much space they take up. Those are two different ways. Oh, there's about as much space below the eye as there is as big as the eye. So I'm going to make sure that I don't make them too big or too small. And when I drew them in before I made them black, they looked kind of funny. They didn't look like the right shape, but I'm just going to get them in there and then we can always make changes. That's why pencil is so nice. You can also, one trick with watercolor is take a little bit of water, get the paint wet again. It's better to do earlier on, but you can lift up some of the paint, or even sometimes if you really need to, if you made a mistake, you can use white paint and paint over. But there we go. All right, let's make his shape a little bit better here. I'm going to notice that his elbow lines up just outside of the ear. So I come down here, make my little elbow. Line up, he doesn't have a neck. Line up the jacket. I'm noticing the different shapes of the lines also. One hand comes here, this hand lines up with almost the middle of the nose. That's pretty good right there. She simplified his little paws, which I am very grateful for. They kind of look like Berenstain Bear hands from those children's books from what I remember. His body looks a little bit longer than I made it, so I can always add that. It's about the same as his head, so make this. All right, it's doing pretty good. And little brown feet. I think he might be wearing shoes, but who knows? And that feels like a good place to start adding color. With watercolor, you have to do lighter colors first because you're layering, so you can't see a light color on top of a dark color. You have to put a dark color on top of a light color. So these are glazes or layers, and I used my light brown here. I already have one mixed up, but you can always mix brown with your three primary colors, and you'll see sometimes it'll make black, but then you have to add a little more red or see what you can do. I'm going to make it a little bit lighter. I can use the paint from my painting already. And I notice that he's got some down here. I'm going to get that a little more wet. And this one I didn't add a wash, so maybe I'll decide, oh, actually the wash didn't work, but we're always just practicing. Add some lighter colors over here. I think his chest and his tummy are meant to be white. I'm picturing a rabbit in the wild who is wearing a jacket. Make this a little bit lighter. Add some color over here. Add a little more water. I just keep looking back and forth, comparing my painting to the one I'm copying. Put a little bit of color inside the ears too. That part looks like it's going to be white. Okay, and while I'm waiting for this first layer to dry, I'm going to add my blue in for the jacket. I'm going to get a smaller paintbrush, a little more detail. And I mixed up this blue last night. So another trick is to mix enough of the color because you might run out of it. One of the trickier parts of watercolor, in my opinion, is mixing colors. And if you run out of the color, you have to make it again, which is okay. Good practice, but sometimes makes more work for yourself. Does that look okay? The other thing is watercolor dries lighter than it looks when you paint it wet. So a lot of people make a palette first, a color palette over on the side to see what the colors look like, and then they dry. That's what professional artists do a lot of times. Like a practice run. All right, well, I might need to add more blue again as a second layer. I'm going to take my towel to wipe up the blue that bled into Mr. Peter Rabbit's chest area. And then this is going to have to dry. I might add some detail to the middle ground here. So the foreground I'm going to paint over afterwards, so it will be in front or before Peter Rabbit, and it will normally have more detail and be darker. And then the farther back I get, it's kind of like you're squinting your eyes and looking out the window. It gets a little hazier and has less detail. So maybe I'll just add some of my leaves here. And if I was Beatrix Potter, I would be looking in my sketchbook to see what the different kind of plants were. And I like that she studied mushrooms, mycology. So I can always come back and add more detail. Maybe I want to add a different color in my middle ground too. You can also use a hairdryer if you're in a hurry to have something dry, or even use a fan. I feel pretty cool, no pun intended. And another trick is to touch the paper with the back of your hand, and if it's cool, that means it's still wet. But I am gonna go in and add some of my smaller, detailed, darker brown colors because it's okay if they mix a little bit. So I'm going to take some brown from my ARTmakers palette and make it a little bit lighter by adding more water. You could use a little spray bottle, or I even have this cool little pipette. Science. Add a little water. Boop. Okay, so I see some darker colors here on Peter's ears. See some lines here in between his eyes. This is his fur, right? So we can leave some lines, some more detail. Some little chest fur. I'm going to go and get a little more direct paint. While I have that darker color, I'm going to add his little feetsies, his little feet. While I'm at it, I'm going to paint his paws. I see a little bit of red in his ears. Teeny tiny. And is it okay if my painting looks different than what I'm copying? Yes, it is very okay. And it's okay to make mistakes, and I'm just doing my best. All right, what is dry that I can paint now? Maybe I will add a little more color to the tummy. Notice how I'm holding my paintbrush. I should have said this in the beginning. If you want to add a lot of details, you can use it like a pencil or a pen. But if I want to paint a little bit more like painterly and see some brush strokes, I would hold it up at the top where the fulcrum has more flexibility, so I can move my paintbrush more and my fingers less. But I can also paint some longer brush strokes in the front, maybe do some different kinds of lines and let them go at the end so they look more like wild grass. Use a couple of different greens. Fill in the hard lines. Again, I'm going to leave the part right in front of Peter till the end. Can't add the pen and ink yet, it needs to dry some more, but I am going to come in and add a little bit more dark blue around the coat for some outlines. I wonder what kind of mischief Peter Rabbit is about to get into. He looks like he's planning something. I want to add a little bit of the blue that I've been using on his coat into the grass. That's sometimes a nice idea to kind of tie it together, move the eye around a little bit. All right, we have to wait a little bit for it to dry. Okay, now that our paint is mostly dry, we can add some of the pen and ink. And like I said, feel free to just use a regular pen. Ballpoint isn't the best. An ink pen would be better. And a marker, if you use it on wet paint, it might ruin it. So just make sure that it's dry. I'm actually gonna have a fun time and use some India ink. Perhaps one of a pen that Beatrix Potter would use, something more like this, which is called a quill because it used to be made out of feathers. All right, so I'm just gonna start up top. And the fun part about this pen also is you can add different thicknesses. And if it does start to bleed a little, that's okay, or you can stop and wait for it to dry a little bit more, but we're just gonna go ahead. Good for adding some texture and some fur, some movement. Some eyebrows or eyelashes, whatever these guys are. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and ink in the eyes. All right, so I think I'm gonna stop there. Oh, nope, one last thing I forgot. I keep talking about adding the foreground last. So I'm gonna go back in with a little bit of green in the front. The foreground comes before, and add some grass. So you feel free to add some more details to the background. You could maybe use marker. She used brush pens, which are really fun. You can almost paint with them. And I really thank you for joining us today on ARTmakers here at Studios on the Park in Paso Robles. Have fun making art.